And we are back from break. Joining us now to discuss the large buildup for war as well as a number of economic issues is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy under Reagan. He's worked for the Wall Street Journal and a number of other publications and organizations. He now has his own blog at paulcraigroberts.org. Doctor, thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be with you.
I'm pleased to have you as well, but not too pleased about the apparent buildup to war. It's been said, obviously in a different context, no man knoweth the hour, but still we see quite the buildup. What do you see on the fronts, sir?
Yes, buildup's been going on a long time, and it seems excessive if no attack on Iran is intended. You know, Juan Cole published a map showing that there are 44 American military bases surrounding Iran. We've got 2 fleets assigned to the Persian Gulf along with NATO warships. We've got American troops posted to Kuwait and Israel. We've got a missile defense system up for Israel. We've got missiles in a variety of our Arab puppet states. So it looks like a war is intended or an attack is intended. You know, it used to be military strategists would say that once mobilization had reached a certain point, war was inevitable. I don't know if they still teach that or not, but that was once the view. And in terms of that view, it certainly looks like war is inevitable.
Yes, sir. Now, in the lead up to the Iraq war, we saw a large propaganda effort to sell us on the ideas of mobile weapons labs and WMDs, all of which turned out to be false. Here we've got basically the nuclear case, but they haven't even been hitting that as hard. Do you expect a further propaganda buildup prior to a movement, or should we be looking to things like false flag attacks and other coming conflicts short of all-out war?
You know, I don't know how it will start. In fact, it may start despite the White House's opposition to the timing. There's so many people in a position to start the war with a false flag attack or anything else. You know, there've been several books published about how President John F. Kennedy came near to being sandbagged by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA into a Cuban invasion and into a nuclear preemptive first strike on the Soviet Union. He saw in time what they were boxing him into and rejected it. And it's entirely possible there could be a false flag attack, even one orchestrated by the Israelis that would force the hand of the United States. In my own opinion, I don't think Obama wants to take the risk of a war with Iran because of the possible disruption of oil, the escalation in price, and this would have serious effects on the United States and European economies. I don't think he wants to take that risk unless polls show that he's losing the election with whoever the Republican candidate turns out to be. So I think he would prefer to wait. Others probably see the spring, early spring, as a prime time to attack because Russia may be in turmoil over its elections. You know, the Russian elections are in March. And the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations funded with the American taxpayers' money from the National Endowment for Democracy, that's how much of the Russian opposition is financed. And so they're already having demonstrations accusing the upcoming elections of being fixed. So if Putin wins, you could see more demonstrations, and they could easily turn violent, and you could see Russia sort of paralyzed by the kinds of upheavals that we've seen in other parts of the world recently. And this would make them ineffective, perhaps, in responding or attempting to block or forestall an attack on Iran. And I'm sure that those planning the war would be more comfortable if they had Russia preoccupied with its own internal problems. So there'll be some conflict, I think, between what some people will see as an ideal time and what Obama would see as an ideal time.
Right.
And the outcome's not predictable.
I think that's a wise observation to put Russia in context. I mean, obviously there's geopolitical points on the map of interest, but you've also got the General Wesley Clark account. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he cites a meeting with Paul Wolfowitz in, I believe, 1991. And Wolfowitz laid out a hit list of countries, Iran, Syria, they were all on the list. And his reason for the timing had to do with Russia and other superpowers not being in a position, at least of interest, to intervene in Middle Eastern interventions and conflicts.
Yes, I think they still think a lot about that. And of course, on February 14th, the Vice President of China is coming to Washington. And how that meeting goes would probably also feed into the decision. What we have to come back to is we've had all these years of propaganda, and the people making these propaganda claims against Iran know that they're not true. You may have seen some of the latest propaganda claims that come from congressmen and senators in Washington who are talking about Iranian influence in South America, that the Iranians are now penetrating South America and organizing terror strikes against the United States. So there's really, I mean, that's absurd, of course, but there's no end to the propaganda, and the people making it have to know that it's false, and so they're making it for some reason. And as we've already said, the organization of so many military forces and being in place, that also implies intent. It's expensive to do that. So there's even some speculation that the reason the United States is winding down the Iraq and Afghan wars is to free up the wherewithal to take on Iran. I don't know whether this speculation is right or not, but a lot of people see the movement toward preparing this massive force against Iran, and so something must lie behind it.
Yes, sir. How do you see the operations in Syria, all the propaganda trying to topple Assad's regime, all the covert warfare going on there, playing into the wider regional war or the Iran crisis?
Well, it's part of the original plan to overturn all the independent Middle Eastern countries. So you had Iraq, Syria, Iran, and they want to get rid of those countries that are not American puppet states. Mm-hmm. So Syria could very well end up like Libya. I think there's been a lot of information that's probably reliable that shows that the United States is financing the rebels in Syria, certainly encouraging them. And so if the propaganda can reach the right level and somehow we can get around China and Russia, I think you would see NATO intervention in Syria along the lines that occurred in Libya. But so far, China and Russia have blocked that. And whether Washington will try to push despite that opposition, I don't know.
And I guess two final questions on the Iranian front. One, do you think the global political awakening, will the people buy another war in terms of media hype? And two, is this a real strain we see in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, or do you think that'll be a factor whether or not the war actually happens?
I don't think there can be any real strain in the relationship because the Israeli government owns Congress. Everyone knows that, and the Congress knows it, the Israeli government knows it, and anyone who pays any attention knows it. So they own Congress. I think the Israelis, the government, not necessarily all the Israeli people, but the Israeli government, it's right-wing, somewhat crazed, and I think they get carried away with their influence and power over the United States government, and they lose their patience if they meet the slightest resistance, like they have apparently met recently from Obama, who has good reasons for not wanting the war right now. And so they, they say, what do you mean? How dare you not do what we want? And so they lose their patience, and it looks like there's a strain. But it's really just the hubris and arrogance of the Israeli leadership, who are used to pulling all of our strings and not meeting any kind of no, well, maybe, or later, or and they don't know how to handle that. They're not used to it.
What a shame. Well, if you could give us an update on the most important economic factors going on, too. I know you've been writing that as well, of course. I mean, it's your focus.
Well, there's no recovery. The only evidence of a recovery is the gross domestic product, the real gross domestic product that is deflated with the newer measures or the newer methodologies used to measure the consumer price index. You see, they have changed in two big ways since about 1980. One way is there are many kinds of adjustments made for quality improvements. And so they use these adjustments to reduce the rate of inflation. They say, oh, that's not really a higher price, that's an increase in quality. Now, some of that is correct, but a good deal of it is simply the product of mathematical models trying to estimate it. It's nebulous, and it may or may not be there, but the effect is, the overall effect that we are confident of is that the inflation rate is reduced by these estimates more than is likely to be the case. And then another thing they have done, now that all started around 1980, 1981, and grew over the decades. Now, beginning with Clinton, they did something else. They added a new development, a new methodology. Instead of measuring inflation with a fixed basket of goods in order to see what the cost of a fixed standard of living was, they used a substitution principle. So if the price of something in the basket of goods that they weight to measure inflation, if one of those goes up in price, they simply substitute something else that didn't go up in price. So if sirloin steak goes up in price, they take it out and stick in round steak. So it's no longer a consistent measure of inflation because the items in the basket change as their prices change. And so if you add that, then obviously you're going to have a lower rate of inflation. On the other hand, if you deflate the GDP, according to the methodologies, say, prior to 1981, you see there's been a tremendous drop and really no recovery. And no other indice or evidence shows a recovery. If you look at, for example, real retail sales, they've not come close to recovering. If you look at consumer confidence, it's not come close to recovering, or housing starts. I mean, they're still way down where they were in 2009, 2010. So there's just no sign of recovery, and yet one was declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They declared it in 2010 and said that it had occurred in 2009. Actually, in my opinion, based on the statistical work of John Williams, we're still in the recession. It's now 4 or more years old. And this is a serious situation for a country to be in.